welcome back, and thank you for joining me for the third episode in my series about the life and crimes of Robert Hallam. In the last episode, we learnt that Robert met Jane and they were married in 1721. After his close shave with the pirates, he decided to leave the mariner's life and settle down when he bought 2 wherries and became a waterman of the Thames. Things between them were very rosy, they had a growing family, and everything seemed great on the surface. But as I began to dig into the information available, I realised that this appearance really wasn't quite the case, because there were some cracks in their relationship, and so far we've discovered that Robert was a pretty bad, mean drunk, who was also quite a womanizer. He had had at least one affair that we know of, and Robert was beginning to become more and more violent towards his wife as their relationship started to break down. It's now time to continue with the story and turn our attention to Jane, her state of mind, what she was up to, and what people saw. It's likely that most people, even up until the day of Jane's death, considered Jane and Robert's marriage a healthy one. But the more I read, the more I realise that really wasn't the case. But as we know with all marriages, the picture that's presented to the outside world is often very different to the relationship that they have behind closed doors. And with regards to Robert and Jane, that seems to be very much the case. Although by September and October, people close to them were becoming aware that they had problems. So let's go back to the Ordinary's account of his conversations with Robert and find out a little bit more about how things were at home for them.
One day when he was out, his wife being besotted with drink, when he came home, he found a poor old charwoman taking care of the house, and her son drawing the beer. Being naturally of a hasty temper, he flew into a violent fit of passion, which he was too apt to do, and then, in a most severe manner, he gave his wife several blows.
Now there are a number of references to the fact that Jane liked to drink. She was running the inn on her own most of the time, and it does sound like she enjoyed a couple of drinks and a bit of fun with the lads. Here's what Robert told the Ordinary about those lads.
That after they kept an ale house, she not only drank, but debauched otherwise, and this his boy first informed him of, and also that when he was at Gravesend 2 nights about his business, the lodger in the house went into his mistress.
Now, Jane and Robert obviously ran an alehouse, which meant they would have had guests staying long-term and some overnight. So the lodger in question is a bit of a question mark, but I did some more digging and I looked in some rag papers that were talking about the trial at the time, with a bit more gossip in there than you would normally get. And yep, the lodger in question is Charles Bird. And Charles Bird is Robert's apprentice.
He severely reprimanded her upon this information, but she denied all, and upon his insisting on the subject, and promising not to maltreat her, she owned familiarity with the fellow 4 times. Upon this, notwithstanding his word to the contrary, he beat her most unmercifully.
So from that account it does appear like Jane was playing away from home a bit. Robert, I should imagine, was very upset when he found out that his wife was having an affair with his apprentice, and in his usual way he took it out on her with his fists. If this was the only indiscretion that she'd had, then possibly they could have sorted this out. But there's more to this than just that one incident.
Another time when he was about a mile from home, with some company a merry-making, he knocked a long time at the door, and endeavoured to push it open, but could not, continuing thus near half an hour and making a great noise. A woman lent him a ladder to step in at the window. When he was ready to go in, the wife came very quietly and said, "Stop, Robin, don't break open the window, I'll open the door." Then he went in at the door, and she for excuse pretended to have been in a deep sleep.
Robert obviously didn't believe this, and after what sounds like quite a violent argument, she finally told him the truth.
She said, there was a man who did not live very far off in company with her, and that her letting him out at the back door, and then undressing herself, that she might appear to have been abed, and all this with great silence, was the occasion of her delaying so long to let him in. After this it could not be thought he entertained any good opinion of her.
It's unclear who exactly the local gentleman really was, but what we do know is that when Robert found out she was having an affair, It sounds like it broke his heart. Elizabeth Emerson, a friend of Jane's, took the stand and provided us with more information about the state of their marriage.
On Wednesday the 8th of December, about 3 in the afternoon, I saw the deceased and asked her how she did. "Oh," says she, "I shall be murdered tonight." "Why so?" says I. "Why," says she, "the child has told me that my husband is gone to eat a leg of mutton and turnips at Will Perkins's, and there he'll get drunk, and then come home and murder me. He had kept account of my reckoning from the 11th of March, but now he has moved it to the 11th of April, and wants me to lay my child to a man in the country. And he said, if I would not, he wished the devil might appear to us both in a great flame of fire, and carry him away before my face, if he did not murder me when he came home at night. And so she desired me to leave my cellar door open that she might run in and hide herself when he came. I told her she should not go in the cellar, but I would leave my other doors open, and she should come into my room and welcome. And so I did, and I don't know whether or no she was coming to me, but he met her, and she turned back.
And later on in Elizabeth's testimony, she goes on to say this.
Many a time have I seen him beat her, and 2 or 3 nights in a week I have heard her cry out murder, and have often gone to help her, and got behind him, and held my arms round his neck thus, while she has run away for fear of being murdered.
And there you have it. Robert obviously suspected that Jane was carrying another man's child, and she was obviously very overdue from the date that she told him of conception, and he was beginning to put 2 and 2 together. Now, whether the pregnancy was the responsibility of the man that left by the back door, or the responsibility of another man, we'll never know. But one contender, and quite a shocking one, is Charles Bird. Now, Charles Bird was Robert's apprentice, and we know from the evidence he gave at the trial that he shared a bed with Acrid Hallam, and he described Acrid as being lame and almost mute. But that doesn't seem to be quite the case, because he seems to have quite a few conversations with his father, and as we've just heard, Acrid seems to be able to chat quite nicely with his mother as well. So when I read that in his testimony, I put a red flag against this chap, and that was before I found out that the lodger in question was in fact Charles Bird. But with regards to sleeping in a bed with a 10-year-old child, there was nothing sinister or unusual about that. In fact, it was very common in those days for everybody just to pile into the same bed, and if it was cold, you could get 6 or 7 people all huddled together. Having said that, popping into bed with somebody else's wife for warmth, I think even then was probably frowned upon. And I'm just wondering if anybody else heard my eyes roll then, because I think I did. From the records, we also know that Robert was a wherryman for at least 8 or 9 years before his trial, and that would have meant that he'd still been at sea in 1722 or 3. So this again takes me back to my theory about the pirates and where Robert's money to start his business came from. With 2 wherries to run and a waterman needed for each, it makes sense that Robert took an apprentice quite early on in his business career in London, and that could have been Charles Bird right from the beginning. And bearing in mind how young apprentices start, Charles would have joined the Hallam family at quite an early age, and having an affair with a man that was brought up from a child in your family, well, that kind of feels a bit creepy to me. And I should imagine Robert probably felt the same, making Charles and Jane's betrayal of him even more hard to handle. So despite having a great marriage up until the last year or so, by the time of Jane's death, it does sound like their marriage was really on the rocks. Both of them have been unfaithful to one another, and Robert suspects that Jane is actually carrying somebody else's child. So by December 1731, every day that went by, Robert was more and more convinced that the child that Jane was carrying wasn't his. And we can get some insight into exactly how that tension was growing from the testimony at his trial from one of his neighbours, a chap called John Fleming.
I have lived next door to the prisoner 3 years. There's only a thin partition between us, so that I can hear every word that's spoke in his room. For this 12-month past, I have frequently heard great outcries of murder, and particularly about 3 weeks before her death, he came home in a jealous fit, and beat her, and swore he'd murder her, if he was hanged for it. I heard her cry, "Oh, for God's sake, mercy! Pity me, pity the tender infant within me. Damn ye, for a bitch, says he, I'll send you, and your infant to the devil together, I'll split your skull, and dash your brains against the back of the chimney. I know I shall come to be hanged at Tyburn for ye.
So it appears that something triggered Robert about 3 months before Jane's death, and I suspect that's the reference that the Ordinary made to Acrid, Robert's son, telling his father that the lodger, while he was away on business, had been sleeping with his wife. And 3 weeks prior to her death was around about her due date. So every day that passed after that, Robert was questioning exactly when that child had been conceived. At the age of about 8 or 9, it's unlikely that Acrid really knew what he'd told his father and the impact that would have not only on his parents' relationship, but on his future too. It's time to go back to the trial now and listen to what Loverboy's got to say about the events of that night, and from his perspective, exactly what happened.
On Wednesday the 9th of December, about 11 at night, I went to bed and fell asleep, but was awaked by a noise between 12 and 1. I heard my mistress in the room under me cry, "Murder, for God's sake don't murder me, for the Lord's sake Robin don't murder me, pity me for Christ's sake, for my poor family's sake." Then she called me, and once she cried louder than ordinary.
Charles Bird went on to say,
The prisoner said, "God damn you, what do you want with Charles?" Prayed he would come up to me, and so I stepped out of bed, and was going to get out of the window to save myself. But a child that lay with me, who was lame, and could not speak plain, though it was 10 years old, cried, "Charlie, Charlie, do no go." Then I considered with myself that by venturing out at window I might be accessory to my own death, and so I went to bed again. I heard a great many very violent blows, which by the sound seemed to be given with the tongs or the fire shovel. By and by the neighbours cried murder, and I heard the street door open, which I thought the people without it broke open. Then I said within myself, by the leave of the Lord I will venture out, as soon as the mob comes in. But presently I heard the prisoner come upstairs into his own chamber.
Charles went on to say,
I got up and was going downstairs about 6 in the morning. I heard a low voice which I thought was my mistress's, and it said, "Charles, go and strike a light, and take the tin pot and draw some beer." I did so, and brought it up. And the voice said again, "Set it down upon the chest and leave it there." I did so, but I neither saw his nor her face, for they were both covered in the bed. And then the voice bid me make a fire, which I did, and while I was blowing it up I heard 2 or 3 dismal groans.
Robert challenges him and asks Charles about what happened and the state of mind of Jane shortly before her death.
Did not you come home to dinner the day before this happened, and your mistress told you she'd give you no victuals, for she intended to make away with herself?
No. I came home to dinner, and there was cold beef. I desired her to let me broil it, and she said, with all her heart, I might do as I would. She was as good a woman as ever broke bread.
Now, Robert, in his cross-examination of Charles, could easily have brought up the affair that Charles was having with Jane, but he didn't. And that says a lot, I think, for me. It is worth noting here, though, that Robert seems to be pushing the idea that Jane was actually suicidal. She was in quite a desperate situation. She was pregnant, allegedly with somebody else's child, and her husband had just found out about it. So yes, emotionally she would have been in a very fragile state. But to be honest, I think she really was more frightened than fragile. So it appears that Robert's defence is that Jane's mental state was so poor that she threw herself out of the window. Oh, and just as a quick side note, defendants were expected to cross-examine the witnesses themselves. They didn't have any legal representation, and they also didn't get any legal advice. So for now, we're going to leave Charles's testimony. We're going to come back to that later because he is the most crucial witness when it comes to whether Jane was pushed. But now it's time to listen to Anne Anderson's side of the story as a neighbour and an eyewitness to the entire event.
I live next door to the prisoner. There is but a thin deal partition betwixt his room and ours, so that one may hear in one room what passes in another very plainly. Between 11 and 12 on Wednesday night, while I was in bed, I heard the prisoner say to his wife, "God damn you, tell me the truth." Several blows were given. I awaked my husband and said, "Do you hear? Hallam's beating his wife according to custom." Then she got from him and ran downstairs and out at the street door. He followed. I opened my window and saw him beat her in the street and force her in again. He shut the door, and while she was in the entry, I heard her cry very loud, "Charles! Charles! Charles!" When they came into the chamber, I heard a great many unmerciful blows, which by the jarring sound I thought to be given by the fire shovel or tongs.
Okay, I just want to stop her there. Either it's very, very commonplace for people to be beaten with fire shovels and tongs, or, and as I suspect, Charles and Anne have been chatting, because their stories are very similar, and is also some of their phraseology is too. In those days, unlike now, witness tampering wasn't a thing. Anyway, back to Anne.
As if her breath was almost gone, she cried, "Oh, oh, oh!" I thought the blows were more like beating an ox than a Christian, a woman big with child. Soon after she cried, "Oh, Robin, spare my life! Don't kill me! For God's sake! For Christ's sake! For my poor infant's sake!" Then I heard her struggling and a rustling towards the window. She gave a lamentable great shriek, and presently I heard something rush from the window with such violence that I thought the window frame had followed. It was between 12 and 1. I jumped out of bed, ran to the window, and looked out. He ran downstairs and came out of the door in his shirt with a candle in his hand. His wife was lying in the street. He damned her for a bitch and said she was drunk. He set down the candle on the bench and, taking her by the arms, dragged her backwards up the stairs into the entry and shut the door. As he was hauling her in, I called out, "You villain! You wicked rogue! You have thrown your wife out the window and killed her!" All the neighbours were alarmed, and several came out and said, "For Christ's sake, don't use the poor woman so, but let somebody help her." But he would let nobody.
Of course, Anne Addison didn't actually see Robert push Jane out the window. She was in the house next door, so wouldn't have been able to. All she did was she heard some noises and she made up her own mind about what happened, and she was quite happy to share those views with the neighbours. And in those days, that's really all it took to turn one person's opinion into fact. At some point, Mary Thompson takes the stand. She's a local in the area, and from the sounds of it, she's friends with Anne Addison.
Coming out of my house, I heard dismal groans. But Elizabeth Mingo cried, "Murder!" I heard the deceased cry, "For God's sake, spare my life. Don't murder me tonight, for my poor children's sake." The prisoner ran to the chimney and took the tongs or shovel, as I guessed by the sound, and gave her several blows. She shrieked, and presently she came backwards out of the window. I heard her groan, and saw the prisoner come out with a candle and drag her in and shut the door.
So I guess 1700s England, they were all beating each other up with tongs and shovels. Anyway, other witnesses took the stand and pretty much told the same story. As with most evidence given by a number of witnesses, there are a few discrepancies, but in the main, the facts of the case are that Robert came home, he was allegedly drunk, he had a row with Jane. Somehow she ended up falling out the window, landing on the pavement. Then Robert was seen dragging her back inside, closing the door, where the argument continued, and the very next thing anyone saw, Jane was falling backwards out the window. Oh, and those fire tongs and coal shovel are in there somewhere, and Robert mentions them too, but more of that later. Now let's hear what Robert says about what happened that night, and we're going back to the Ordinary's account here for those details.
The account he gave of the murder was, that he went out with company the day before the death of his wife, and coming home pretty late at night, he went directly to bed, but his wife sate on the bedside, turning her garter in her hand, and not like to come to bed. He desired her several times to lie down, she would not, but at length run to the door, and downstairs. He jumped out of bed, and overtook her at the street door, as she was going out, took her by the neck of her gown, and forced her back into the house. And then he gave her 2 or 3 hearty blows while he was locking the street door. She run upstairs and shut the chamber door with the poker, or some such thing, he having the candle in his hand, and being in his shirt desired her to let him in, otherwise he threatened to beat her with his cane, but it was hanging on a nail in the bed-chamber where she was. Then he endeavoured to open the door by force, which at last he did, and as he was coming in at the door, she threw herself out at the window backwards. I asked him how her hand came to be so wounded. He said that dropping down by the hands, it had been hurt upon the iron hook which keeps the window open, and that she had fallen down upon her feet. He run down immediately and said she was not dead then, but went upstairs with his help, and spoke to him some hours after that.
So now we've heard Robert's side of the story. There are a few question marks against it, how he exactly knew that she landed on her feet and fell backwards, if he was still coming through the door when she backed out of it. But in general, I actually believe him. After all, he's talking to a chaplain. He's just about to be executed. He was obviously a religious man, so therefore I don't believe he necessarily would have lied to the ordinary of Newgate. He might have bent the truth a bit, or added a few details to strengthen his case, but I do believe that the testimony that he gives to James Guthrie is pretty accurate from his perspective. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to finish this episode. In the next episode, we're going to hear some more witnesses. They're going to contradict what Robert said, and then we're going to hear back from Charles Bird. And I believe that he is the chap that put the nail in Robert's coffin. But more of that next time. Thanks for watching, do all that lovely stuff again, and I'll see you in the next episode.